That was the night I called my brother. And that was the night I finally understood what my mother had been trying to tell me for 2 years. I met Callum. No, wait, that name's taken. I met Adrian at a work event in October. One of those corporate mixers at a hotel ballroom in downtown Toronto where everyone's holding a glass of sparkling water and pretending they're not desperately scanning the room for someone interesting to talk to. He was standing near the cheese table, looking equally miserable about being there, and I walked over and said, "If you grab me a cracker, I'll pretend to laugh at whatever you say next." He handed me the cracker and said, "My mother thinks I should be a dentist." I laughed. Not pretend laughing. Real laughing. We dated for 14 months before his family invited me to a Christmas dinner at their house in Oakville. 14 months. I thought that was enough time to know someone. I thought I knew what I was walking into. Adrian's mother, Sylvia, had called me twice in the 2 weeks before the dinner, once to ask about dietary restrictions, which I thought was thoughtful, and once, 3 days before Christmas, to casually mention that Adrian's ex-girlfriend Paige had also been invited because she's practically family at this point, and I didn't want there to be any awkwardness. She said it the way you'd mention a small scheduling inconvenience, like a parking ticket, not like a grenade. I said, "Oh, okay." I said it calmly, and then I sat on the edge of my bathtub for about 15 minutes, wondering if I was being unreasonable. My mother, when I told her, was not confused at all. She said, "That woman is testing you." I told her she was reading too much into it. My mother has a way of going very quiet when she disagrees with you. She didn't argue. She just said, "All right, sweetheart," in the tone she uses when she's decided to let you learn something for yourself. Adrian said Paige being there was not a big deal and that his mother was just like that, meaning disorganized, meaning she didn't think things through, meaning it wasn't malicious. I wanted to believe him. I chose to believe him. That was the first choice I regret. The drive to Oakville took about 40 minutes from my apartment in the West End. Adrian drove. I had brought a bottle of Niagara ice wine and a poinsettia because I had Googled what to bring to Christmas dinner at your boyfriend's parents' house at 11 o'clock the night before, like a person who is trying very hard to do everything right. I was wearing a burgundy wrap dress that my friend Jess had helped me pick out. I had done my hair. I was prepared. I was not prepared. The house was one of those newer builds in a subdivision where every street is named after something that used to be there before the subdivision. Meadow Lane, Birchwood Court, Heritage Grove. Sylvia and Adrian's father, Robert, had moved there 6 years ago when Robert retired from his position at a regional bank. The house was large and impeccably decorated in the way that suggests someone put a lot of effort into making it look like no effort was put in. Sylvia opened the door before we knocked. She was exactly what I had expected from the phone calls. Well-dressed, composed, the kind of woman who smiles with her whole face except her eyes. She kissed Adrian on both cheeks and then turned to me and said, "You must be Meg." "My name is not Meg. My name is Megan, and I go by Megan, and Adrian knew that, and I had never told Sylvia anything different." I smiled and said, "Megan, actually," and she said, of course," and ushered me inside. Paige was already there. She was sitting in the living room with Adrian's younger sister, Brooke, and they were laughing about something when we walked in. She was. And I say this with absolutely no bitterness because I have processed this thoroughly. She was beautiful in the specific way that you acutely aware of what you're wearing. She stood up when she saw us, and she hugged Adrian, and then she looked at me with a warm, open smile and said, "You must be Megan. I've heard so much about you." She said my name correctly, immediately, without being corrected. I don't know what to do with that. I introduced myself and shook her hand and made conversation, and I was, I think, doing fine. Adrian's father, Robert, was warm and a little scattered, kept asking me about my job. I'm a project manager at a mid-sized construction company, and seemed genuinely interested. Brooke was pleasant, if a little distracted by her phone. There were other people, aunts, a couple of cousins, a neighbor who'd been coming to Christmas dinner for a decade, and seemed more at home there than I did. It was during dinner that things started to shift. Sylvia was seated at the head of the table, and she had, I noticed, placed me at the far end near the cousins, while Paige was seated directly to her left. Next to Adrian, I had been placed across from a 14-year-old named Luca, who spent the meal showing me videos of his hockey team on his phone, which I genuinely didn't mind, but still. I watched Sylvia talk to Paige the way you talk to someone you've missed. She kept touching Paige's arm. She laughed at everything she said. At one point, she looked down the table at me, this long, appraising look, and said, loudly enough for the table to hear, "Megan, what did you say you do again?" "Project management? That must be so. Functional." The table didn't go quiet. That's the thing, it wasn't dramatic enough for the table to go quiet. Most people kept talking. But Brooke looked up from her phone for a second, and Paige pressed her lips together in a way that might have been suppressing a smile or might have been suppressing discomfort. I still don't know which. And Adrian said nothing. He said nothing. I said, "It keeps the lights on," and smiled, and went back to my food. After dinner, when the adults had moved to the living room and the cousins had scattered and someone had put on a Christmas playlist at a volume that was somehow both festive and oppressive, Sylvia found me near the kitchen doorway. I had been looking for Adrian. She positioned herself between me and the rest of the room in a way that felt deliberate, though I can't prove it. She said, "Can I ask you something?" Woman to woman. I said, "Of course." She said, "How serious is this for you?" Because Adrian has a tendency to. He gets swept up in things. He always has. I just want to make sure you're being realistic about where this is going. I looked at her. I said, "I think that's a conversation for Adrian and me to have." She tilted her head slightly. She said, "He was going to propose to Paige, you know, before things fell apart. She was really part of this family." She paused. "I just think it's important to be honest about expectations." I don't know what I would have said, because that's when my phone buzzed in my pocket. My brother Kevin calling, which was unusual because Kevin knows I was at dinner. I excused myself and stepped into the hallway and answered. Kevin said, "Hey, sorry to interrupt. Mum fell on the ice outside her building. She's okay, not serious, but she's at Trillium and asking for you." I hung up and went to find Adrian. He was in the den with Robert and two of the cousins watching a hockey game. The Leafs were playing, because of course they were, and when I came in and told him my mother had fallen and I needed to leave, his first response was not, "Of course," or "Let's go." His first response was, "Right now, the game's in the third." He did come. Eventually. After I said, "Yes, right now," in a voice that apparently communicated something, because Robert was already standing up and saying he hoped my mother was all right. Sylvia appeared in the doorway to say goodbye. She looked at me and said, with perfect pleasantness, "I hope everything's fine. Drive safe." And then she looked at Adrian and said, "Don't be too long. Don't be too long." I sat in the passenger seat on the way to the hospital, and I stared at the streetlights going past, and I thought about my mother going quiet on the phone. I thought about, she was going to be part of this family. I thought about where I'd been seated. I thought about functional. My mother was sitting up in a hospital bed with a wrapped ankle and a cup of tea when we arrived. Her name is Carolyn, and she is 63 years old. And she is one of the calmest people I know, but she has a specific look she gets when she's taking inventory of a situation and finding it wanting. She looked at Adrian when we came in, not rudely. Just looked at him, long and steady, the way you'd look at a document you were deciding whether to sign. Adrian stayed for maybe 20 minutes. He had driven separately. Something about wanting to go back to his parents' place, since he rarely got to spend time with the cousins. And he kissed me on the forehead before he left and said, "Text me when you know more." My mother waited until his footsteps faded down the hallway. Then she said, "Tell me about tonight." I told her everything. All of it, the seating arrangement, the functional comment, the conversation in the hallway, the hockey game. She listened without interrupting, which is unusual for her, which told me she was taking it seriously. When I finished, she said, "What did Adrian say?" "When you told him what his mother said in the hallway." I realized I hadn't told him yet. I had been going to, in the car. But I had just sat there, watching the streetlights. My mother said, gently, "Megan." I said, "I know." She said, "That woman told you to your face that you are a temporary inconvenience in her son's life, and he sat in there watching the Leafs." I said, "He didn't know what she'd said." My mother said, "He knew you'd had a hard night, and he still had to be asked twice to leave." She was right. She's usually right about things I don't want her to be right about. I spent that night at my mother's apartment. She has a spare room that still has my old twin bed in it, the kind of detail that's embarrassing at 31 but comforting at moments like this. And I called Adrian in the morning and told him about the hallway conversation with Sylvia. About the proposal comment, about be realistic about your expectations. He went quiet for a moment. Then he said, "My mom she's protective. She doesn't mean it the way it sounds." I said, "How does she mean it?" He said, "She just loves Paige, like they have a relationship." "That doesn't mean." I said, "She told me she expected you to propose to Paige." He said, "I mean, we talked about it before. That was years ago." I said, "She told me at your family's Christmas dinner." Another pause. Then, "I'll talk to her." He didn't, or if he did, nothing changed. I know this because of what happened 2 months later. His cousin Dawson was getting married in February. A small ceremony at a venue in Burlington, one of those converted farmhouse spaces with exposed wood beams and Edison's bulbs, and a bar that opened at 4. Adrian had asked me to come as his date before Christmas, back when things still felt uncomplicated. I had bought a dress. I had cleared my weekend. I had RSVP'd. 2 weeks before the wedding, Adrian called and said his mother had gently suggested. He said, like the word gently was doing any work there, that maybe it would be easier if I didn't come. Since Paige would be there, since she and Dawson's fiancé were close, since there might be tension. I said, "What tension?" "I'm not tense. I've never even spoken to Dawson's fiancé." Adrian said, I know. Mum thinks it might be awkward." I said, "For who?" He didn't answer that. I said, "Adrian, I RSVP'd. I bought a dress. You asked me to come to your cousin's wedding," he said. I know. Can we talk about it in person?" I did not go to the wedding. That's the summary. What happened in between that phone call and the wedding was 2 weeks of me waiting for Adrian to do something, to say something clear, to tell his mother no, and him not doing it. He kept saying he needed more time to smooth things over. He kept saying his mother was going through a lot. Robert had had some health problems, which was real, and I had sympathy for, but it had nothing to do with a wedding seating arrangement. He kept saying, I called my brother Kevin the night before the wedding. Kevin is 35. He is 4 years older than me, and he works in commercial real estate. And he is, in most social contexts, a person of great restraint and diplomacy. But he has a line, and when you describe a situation to Kevin that has crossed his line, he gets very still and very quiet, and then he says something very short and very clear. He said, "He's not going to change." I said, "You don't know that." Kevin said his mother disinvited you from a family wedding because she prefers his ex. He went along with it. That's not a one-time thing. That's a pattern. I said, she's going through a hard time. Kevin said, Megan, that's not the standard for how someone gets to treat you. He was right. I knew he was right. I had known for 2 weeks, probably longer, but there is something about hearing it in your brother's voice, flat and certain and not unkind, that makes it impossible to keep pretending. I texted Adrian that night. I said I needed to talk after the wedding. He texted back a thumbs up, which in retrospect tells you everything about where his head was. The wedding happened. I sat at home in my new dress and watched a home renovation show on CBC and ate leftover Thai food and felt alternately sad and furious and weirdly relieved. Around 9 o'clock, I got a text from a number I didn't recognize. It said, "Hi, Megan. This is Paige. I heard you were uninvited from today. I want you to know that had nothing to do with me and I'm sorry it happened." Dawson's wife told me this afternoon. I stared at that text for a long time. I wrote back, "Thank you. I hope you had a good time." Because I didn't know what else to say, and because I found I didn't actually have any anger toward Paige. She hadn't done anything. She just existed in a way that Sylvia had chosen to weaponize. Adrian came to my apartment the next morning. He brought coffee from the place I like on Roncesvalles. A detail that in other circumstances would have been a good sign, but in this one felt like a man who knew he needed to show up prepared. He sat down at my kitchen table, and he looked tired, and I thought, not for the first time, that he was someone who cared about me but did not know how to choose me when choosing me cost him something. I told him everything I'd been sitting with. All of it. The Christmas dinner, the hallway, the wedding, the text from Paige, which he went pale about, and then defensive about, which told me Sylvia had told him something different about why I wasn't there. I showed him the text. He read it 3 times. He said, "I didn't know Paige reached out." I said, "That's the least important thing about what I just told you." He said, "I'll talk to my mom. I swear, this time I'll actually." I said, "Adrian, I need you to hear me. This isn't about your mother anymore. This is about you. You let her disinvite me from a family event, and you didn't stop it. You came back to me with a coffee." He looked at his coffee cup. He set it down. He said, "I don't know how to manage her and have a relationship at the same time." I said, "I know, and I don't think you're going to figure that out while you're with me, because I'm the part you keep choosing to manage down." He didn't argue with that. That was the thing. He sat there and he looked at the table and he didn't argue with it because some part of him knew it was true. I asked him to leave. He did. I sat at my kitchen table for a while after. My coffee went cold. The CBC Morning News was on in the background. Some story about a transit delay on the 504, which felt extremely beside the point. I called Kevin. I said, "It's done." He said, "Okay." Then he said, "I'll come over." And he did, which is the thing about Kevin. He doesn't make it a big deal. He just shows up. Sylvia called me that evening. I almost didn't pick up. I did pick up. She said she was sorry to hear things hadn't worked out. She said she'd always hoped Adrian would find someone who fit. She said this in the specific tone of someone who is performing concern while carrying absolutely zero of it, and I thought, she really thinks this is over now. She thinks she won. I said, "Sylvia, I want to say something, and I'd like you to actually hear it." I said it calmly. Not cold, not loud. Just clear. What you did at Christmas and what you arranged with the wedding, those weren't small things. You told me to my face that I was temporary. You organized a situation where I was excluded from a family event so your son's ex-girlfriend would be more comfortable. And Adrian went along with it because he's been going along with you his whole life. I don't think you're a bad person. I think you love your son and you have no idea what it costs him. She was quiet. I said, He's a good man who doesn't know how to stand up for the people he loves. That's not my problem to solve. But I'm saying it because someone should. She said, after a moment, I see. I said, take care of yourself, and I hung up. Kevin, who was on my couch eating leftover pad thai at the time, looked up and said, how do you feel? I thought about it. I said, like I just took a jacket off that I didn't realize was this heavy. He said, good. That was 8 months ago. I'm not going to tell you I'm over it, because that's not how it works. I still think about the drive to the hospital watching the streetlights. I still think about that Christmas dinner and where I was seated and the word functional said in front of a table full of people. I still, sometimes, miss who I thought Adrian was when we were standing by the cheese table at a corporate mixer and he looked miserable and funny and like someone I could trust. But I've learned something about the kind of person who lets someone else do their hard work for them. Who hands you the cracker and makes you laugh, and then, when things get complicated, goes very still and waits for the storm to pass around him. That kind of person isn't choosing you. They're just not choosing against you yet. My mother's ankle healed up by February. She sent me a text when I told her it was over. She said, I'm sorry and I'm proud of you. Then she said, you want me to come over Saturday? I'll bring the good cheese. I said yes. She did. We watched old episodes of Schitt's Creek and didn't talk about Adrian at all. It was exactly what I needed. Some things take time. Some things just take the right person sitting on your couch, handing you a cracker and actually meaning it.